I'm Eddie Rester.
I'm Chris McAlilly. Welcome to today's episode of The Wait. I'm here today. My name is Chris McAlilly. Welcome to The Wait, and I'm here today with my good friend, the Reverend Dr. Kevin Muriel, senior pastor of Cascade United Methodist Church in Southwest and Midtown Atlanta. But I've been knowing Kevin since he was here in Mississippi, and also on a journey through seminary to Candler School of Theology over at Emory University. And so, Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, man, good to be with you, Chris. Honored, man, just to hang out with my buddy and my friend and, just one of our most outstanding leaders in Methodism and across the country, man. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you as well. I kicked Eddie out of the conversation because I just wanted to talk to you today.
That's cool.
Eddie's not with us. So I've been looking forward to this, catching up, but also just kind of hearing a little bit more about how you approach your ministry. I'd love to maybe just start with tell us just a little bit about where your background, kind of your family of origin, where you came from, and kind of your sense of call to ministry.
Well, man, I'm a country boy from Brandon, Mississippi, man. I'm born and raised, like we say in the country, and reared in Mississippi. It's interesting. I'm in Atlanta, but my roots are in the deep South, and I grew up in church, lifelong United Methodist, and just felt a sense of call early on. Nothing supernatural about it. It was just, I felt like, I was raised in church, the church at Port so mentioned to me, and I knew that at some point the church would need leadership. And so I owe so much to my parents, man, but there were people along my journey, as I look back on it now, they were just so key. And, just the formation. There was this man named Mr. Hayward Sutton. And he was the Sunday school superintendent in our small church in Brandon. And every Sunday, he would allow me to come with him around to the Sunday school classes and collect the offering. And I would have to stand up and give the Sunday school report at the end of Sunday school. That's when we used to have the little wooden board and used to, tell how many people were in attendance and how much you collected in Sunday school. We don't use those anymore. But yeah, man, and I was his assistant Sunday school superintendent, and little did I know it was in those moments where I was learning how to public speak, speak in public. And so, man, I just see so many different moments across the years that have formed and shaped my calling as a pastor, as a leader, as one who loves the church. But at my core, man, I'm an easygoing, I love sports. My mom and dad I don't know if they even missed one or two games my entire life. You and I played ball together. And so soccer was definitely one of my main sports. Played college football at Jackson State University, and leaving Jackson State, went to Emory to seminary and on to Duke. And hey, man, landed in Atlanta, got married. The rest is history.
Yeah, you're in Georgia now, and it'll be hard to get you to ever come back to Mississippi. I wonder, tell us a little bit about where you're serving, the context of ministry that you're in, and a little bit about the church. We were talking a little bit about it before we began recording. Tell us a little bit about your church.
Yeah, Cascade is a historic African-American church here in Atlanta, one of the largest in our denomination, pastored by Reverend Walter Kimbrough for 26 years, also pastored by the Dean of the Civil Rights Movement, the late Dr. Joseph Lowry, who was actually my personal mentor when I got to Atlanta. And so just a rich history of Cascade, some of your, prominent, political figures and physicians and educators from Atlanta have come through Cascade and are still there. And so the historic Southwest campus is, the most well-known. But then in 2022, we were able to launch Cascade Midtown in partnership with the General Board of Global Ministries here at Midtown in Midtown Atlanta through a merger with Grace United Methodist Church. We took over Grace and became Cascade Midtown here. So now we're one church, two locations, and still holding on to that history of justice and equity, and fighting the good fight that was started many, many years before I got here. And so, it's been a great ride, man. I'm almost 10 years in. I celebrate the start of my 10th year this year. And so it's a wonderful community. And we just recently built our first international campus in the Central African Republic. And so it's a small country south of Congo, and it is war-torn country. And so through a partnership with Global Ministries, we built the very first United Methodist Church in the Central African Republic, and it is booming. It's called Bethel Cascade, and so that's been pretty cool to see that church emerge and explode with growth. So, the Lord's allowed us to do some pretty good ministry, and just continue to be excited about it.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I want to hear more about your current context and kind of your, some of the things that that light you up and inspire you for the work that you're doing. But before we get there, I wanted to maybe just backtrack. I've heard you speak a couple times just about kind of your journey, and I know that some of your doctoral work and some of your writing has looked back at some of the racial dynamics that both you experienced in the church in Mississippi, and then also that are kind of a part of the conversation um, in the United Methodist Church across the country. And I think you're one of our best thinkers in terms of some of those dynamics and some of the challenges that we have both in healing and renewing the church as we move into kind of this next season of the church's life. And I wonder, I've heard you tell a story, and it may be that might be a place to start. We have a
Yeah,
shared history at a church
yeah.
in Mississippi and in the Tupelo area. And I remember hearing you tell a story publicly with a group of pastors, and it was impactful because it shaped your experience. It was a church that we both have a history and relationship with, but our experience is very different. And I wonder if you'd be willing to share it.
Man, Chris, I think at this point we're family, man. I've seen how our journeys have kind of overlapped, and had no idea that when I went to First Methodist in Tupelo, that was kind of your family's church. Your dad had pastored there, your uncle's there, and the Makalili name is known everywhere in Tupelo. And so had the opportunity in seminary. I remember Andy Ray, who was the pastor at the time, came to Candler looking for an African American student to come to serve on the staff at First Methodist of Tupelo. I think it was probably the first time that it happened. And so, went through a process of students who kind of interviewed, and somebody shared with him my name. He gave me a call. We talked. He invited me to come on the team for the summer. I was elated. I get to go back home. Never really spent any, appreciable amount of time in Tupelo. I just keep on going, up towards Memphis or, Oxford. But yeah, man. So got to Tupelo, and Andy and his family were great. But I remember that first Sunday, and I write about this. That first Sunday that I was there and got robed up, and was going out in the traditional service to greet folks. And I approached this gentleman. I don't even know who he was. I probably would know him now. I forget his name. But approached this older white gentleman, and extended my hand because, I'm from Mississippi, and my parents taught us always to, greet people, love on people, look people in the eye, shake a hand. And this gentleman would not shake my hand. And so that was kind of my um, introduction. And so I sat with that the whole service. I was like, man, okay. So then after that, I think there was a fellowship in the fellowship hall after worship. And I felt so deflated and defeated after that first experience that I went back to the really beautiful house they had put me in for the summer, and just kind of sat there, and really wrestled with whether or not I needed to leave,
Right.
because I don't think I ever told Andy about that situation. I called my dad and talked to him about it, and he said, this is just a par for the course, and you don't know how God's going to work in that community with you being there. And so it's not like you've never experienced that before, right? So, man, went back the next day and just made some incredible relationships. I think Reagan Muskelly was there, and man, just the was it Cleet, Chef Cleet? I think Cleet was there, the chef, and got to meet him. And man, the staff was just phenomenal. And throughout the summer, I was able to go meet people in the city, and a lot of members of your family just embraced me. And by the end of the summer, they were inviting me back for another summer, and I went back the next summer, and since then, I think you all have had a series of African American pastors. I think Sepeda Thomas served there, and then Amber Jackson ended up serving there as senior pastor. And so, I would like to think that I had something to do with kind of the process of that door, those doors opening. But I think I learned so much from that community and how to navigate the space around how it is that we need to approach race, not just from a social aspect, but really from a spiritual aspect and an ecclesial one at that. And so that's what drove my doctoral work at Duke. I looked at racial reconciliation as a heterogeneous model for American Christian life, looking at the trends of how the church is going to be formed and shaped and how communities are going to change over the next, then it was 2012 that I started the work. But by 2030, I mean, we're already seeing it now, you know, communities in America look different than they did 20 years ago.
Right.
And so if the church doesn't start to reflect that diversity, then we're going to really, I think, lose the momentum of our witness and discipleship. So that's just a little bit of the work that I've been able to do. But man, Tupelo was so impactful in helping to form me in this reality of racial reconciliation.
I really appreciate you sharing and telling the story. And I think that it's helpful. I think for me to hear kind of how you reflect on that. I also have heard you talk about these kind of macro trends that you've written about and are kind of informing the way in which you're positioning your leadership and positioning your church to not only be a witness but also kind of a driver of change within the larger denomination. And I wonder if you would just reflect a little bit, like from like one experience at one location when you're an intern. Now you're a senior leader in the church, and
Mhm.
you've been in a lot of the important, impactful conversations that are happening among those that are trying to help the church imagine a new, kind of a new reality, a new future. Just how are you thinking about that? I mean, I wonder, you being one of the pastors of the largest churches in the denomination, seeing the ways in which denominational structures both are and are not agile, nimble, capable of quickly moving or changing. I
Yeah.
just wonder how you're thinking about it kind of more broadly as you continue to kind of live in this reality, both as a local pastor, but also kind of with some hopes and dreams of shaping the broader conversation.
Yeah, man, it's a great question. I'll reflect on it. I think from a couple of different angles. First of all, I think it's hard to focus on some of our more important issues when you're in a constant battle over one in particular. We fought for 50 years over human sexuality in the church, and then we just had a huge split. And so, okay, that battle, let's just say for the time being, is resolved, if you would. Disaffiliation has happened. Okay. I would argue, and I'm very blunt about this, that was largely a white issue. When you see across the denomination, the overwhelming majority of congregations that disaffiliated were white and Southern and from the South. I mean, and that's just data driven, right? I presented on this at the leading edge a couple years back. So we see that, right? So what issues now that disaffiliation has happened, what do we need to center? Like, okay, it's happened. Now what? And so my contention is we've pushed race and dealing with the inequities regarding race within our denomination. We have pushed it aside since the inception of our church, since we merged with the EUBs, and we still haven't had any in my opinion, substantive conversations or even movement around what does equity in this denomination really look like? I mean, let's just be honest. What does it look like? And I think that won't happen until we are willing to be just brutally and blatantly honest, and have a season of reckoning with our history. And that can look, that can look difficult and ugly for some, you know, but you don't get to healing until you really kind of deal with the reality of what has been. You and I grew up, in Mississippi, and so we know a lot. We've seen a lot, and so for me, it's never been difficult to talk about race because it's helped to form and shape who I am as a human. I am a proud black man, right? I love being black. I want my children to be Scarlett and Anderson. I want them to be proud to be black and proud of their history. And at the same time, understand that they are a part of a larger collective, right? Of brothers and sisters across the world, not just white folk, not just Hispanics or Asians, but we are part of a global community. And so, what does that mean for our Afro-Caribbean brothers and sisters? What does it mean for those who we're ministering to, on the continent of Africa, who have very different kind of ideological, um, ideological constructs, as it relates to church, and we're still doing ministry there. So it's a broader conversation, and I think until we say it's not just a conversation about black and white, it is. But it's also a much more broader conversation than that. I think we're going to keep on kicking the can down the road, as we say in the country, and we're not going to deal with it. My contention is that we need to call a special general conference to deal with race, and let's just talk about it.
Right.
And let's spend a few million on that, and talk about the inequities in appointment making, and in our university systems, right? How resources are distributed. You know, let's talk about our apportionment system, right? So let's talk about the balance of power, in the connection. So, in as much as we're talking about restructuring and reframing things, this is a wonderful time, I think, for us to create as rigid of a system as we have, and it is rigid. It takes a conference after a conference, after 4 years, after another conference, after a leadership gathering, after all this to change anything in our connection. But I do think we have to start somewhere. You know, I don't have the answers, Chris, all of them, but I think we've got to start with the reality of where we've been if we're trying to go anywhere in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And so, yeah, so my father and grandfather both uh, Mississippi, and so was from Winston County, so outside of Louisville, and poor Mississippi dirt farm is kind of where he
Hmm.
grew up. And the reason they were Methodist is because they moved from South Carolina where they were Presbyterian, and the dirt farm was down the road from the Methodists rather than the Presbyterian
Okay.
church. So that's where they ended up. And he didn't have any prospects. So like he could have been a mechanic, he could have been an electrician, he could have gone in the army. He was invited to go to this national conference with when he was 18 with kids from Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. They went up on a railroad to Chicago and down to Ohio. He said it was the first time he ever breathed air outside of the state of Mississippi. And he came back with a call to
Wow.
ministry. When
Yeah.
Millsaps found out he could get paid a little bit to go be a student pastor. And so that's how he ended up in ministry in the Methodist Church. And so what I've realized in doing kind of looking back at his story is really it was a path for him into the middle class.
Yeah.
From
Yeah.
working, a working poor working middle class family to a middle class life.
Yeah.
And he was super committed to the institution of the United Methodist Church. And he
Hmm.
did a good job, and so he had a good reputation, and my father benefited from that. And so I recognize and my father's been a bishop in the United Methodist Church, and so,
Hmm.
my position in the church is a place of extraordinary privilege, white privilege,
Hmm.
you know, I'm a straight white American man from Mississippi. And so it just is what it is. I can't do anything about that. It just is. That's just what I've
Oh,
been
it
given.
is what it is.
And so when I went off to Nashville, left Mississippi, finished college, went to Birmingham Southern. So I was in Birmingham. I had not, I wasn't really like engaged with the church when I left Mississippi. I left my family, my home of origin. I wasn't really like engaging campus ministry. I wasn't really engaging church in Birmingham. But when I got to Nashville, I really started to kind of begin thinking about where I came from, and like I was beginning to explore call to ministry. I didn't know it yet.
Sure. Yeah.
And I met two individuals. One was a guy named Don Shockley. Don had been in Birmingham when Dr. King wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail, and he was an associate pastor at a white church, a white moderate church that wasn't engaged in the civil rights movement in any way. And he ultimately left Birmingham after reading that letter, and he ended up and he was a chaplain out in California, and he met Howard Thurman,
Mm.
and they became deep and intimate, wonderful friends. And he encouraged me ultimately to go to Candler. And the first person he introduced me to was Dr. Luther Smith, who was a student
Yeah.
of Dr. Thurman's. And so I had this long and rich conversation with Don running. Meanwhile, Vanderbilt University was inviting back, Vanderbilt Divinity School, that is, was inviting back and giving an honorary doctorate to the Reverend Dr. James Lawson, who was
Oh, yeah.
a seminal figure in the civil rights movement. If you don't know Dr. Lawson,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
worth going and reading his story. But essentially, he was kicked out of Vanderbilt for his role in leading a student sit-in movement to kind of change the trajectory of the movement in the Nashville community. And I audited his course at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Vanderbilt was like, "We love you. We're sorry we kicked you out, and
Yeah.
here's an honorary doctorate." Anyway, so he taught a course that was called Jesus Against Christianity, and it was this amazing experience where he was inviting in all these faith leaders from the movement that had been friends of his into the class. And so it was kind of the first time I, kind of was thinking about, what the church had been in Mississippi, which was a place where African American men and women were barred from the doors of Galloway in downtown Jackson from communion in a particular moment of time. And then here's this United Methodist pastor, who is kind of offering this different picture. All of that was super helpful to know. And that was history that I did not know. And it was all
Right.
a part of kind of this journey and kind of understanding a different picture of what the church had been in Mississippi. And having come back to Mississippi after going to Atlanta and coming back, what I realized is just like, it's the United Methodist Church in Mississippi is just a very different experience
Yeah.
in the black church and in the white church. And there are a
Mhm.
lot of different reasons for that I'm still
Yeah.
trying to understand, frankly. But part of it is it's driven by economics. It's driven by, you know, uh, racial, cultural factors. In terms of what it would actually look like to have, a deep and meaningful conversation about race across the entire denomination, some of those factors are in, certainly in Mississippi and across the southeastern jurisdiction. I certainly, you kind of laid out a list of some things that would need to be talked about if we were going to have this hypothetical, conference where we would spend
Mhm.
millions of dollars to come together and have,
Yeah.
an intentional conversation about some of those factors. Some of it would be historical,
Yep.
understanding kind of how we got to where we are. I think that's super important. Some of it would be financial, and just kind of looking at how the finances flow across the denomination.
Mhm.
And you mentioned some other factors. I just wonder if you were going to set the agenda for that general conference and you were the general secretary of it. What would be some of the things you would put on the agenda?
Wow. That's really a good question, Chris. I think you've outlined it. I think there has to be there really has to be a telling of the history and an understanding of the history. I just don't. I think it's really hard to contextualize where you go if you don't have, kind of where you've been. And even the story you just shared. Now, I never would have known that if, storytelling is powerful. It is so powerful. And I think when we start to understand people's stories and really take time to listen and be present, you'd be surprised, some of the things that you learn and, really how you find out, that we're not that much different. We're not that different, right? In many ways. Um, I think that'd be the first part. I then think there needs to be something around language. And I remember when I served a church here in during seminary. It was in Fairburn, Georgia, and I was a student pastor there, and I was the first African American pastor to go to church in a transition community. So there were still quite a few white members there, and it was amazing to me at Wednesday supper how there was always this sense of, okay, let us show our black pastor that we really do like black people. Like, we're not racist, and I think that's kind of the first thing that people go to when you start talking about race. It's like, okay, if you mention white privilege or if you mention some, it's like, okay, they must think that and no, that's not even so I think this language, and then sometimes people don't even know. I've had people say, well, like, do you want to be called African American? You want to be called black? I mean, and then I say to you, you want to be called white? You want to be called European? Like, what do you want? So what do you want to be called? And so there's such a, you know, and with all good intention, right? With all good intention. But I do think there has to be some language sharing around, what to say, what's okay to say. Al Vivian, who is CT Vivian's son, when I was going through Leadership Atlanta, he did race day for us here in with Leadership Atlanta, and he used a unique phrase. He said he's his friend's cultural informant. So, like, if there's something that they need to understand about our culture, he was like, all right, you have liberty to come and ask me, so that you don't get out here and start saying something that's going to really get you kind of, get you looked at sideways. So I would rather you come and ask me about it. And I think we've got to provide space for that. I mean, I would rather someone come and ask me, hey, look, Kevin, I just don't know. Can you tell me? Can you help me? Now I'm not speaking for all black folk. I'm just saying, I just think those conversations are important. That's that. It take a whole day just talk about language and then culture. Like, we really have to have an immersion into understanding culture. That as an African American man, my experience in America and even in the world is different than someone who is, Afro Caribbean. Very different experiences. And so just because we share the same skin tone doesn't mean we share the same cultural experience. And I think that is another, again, that's education. Chris, I could go on and on about, and then we hadn't even gotten to the issues yet, right?
Yeah, just
We
setting the
hadn't even
table.
gotten to the,
Yeah, it makes
yeah,
sense.
I mean, you have to set the table. So I think, we would spend a few days just setting the table. And then in an attempt to move forward, I would really look to address some of the major challenges that we see across our connection. Again, like I said, appointment making. Um, I think symbolism is important. There have been people who have wrestled with the idea of a logo of a flame burning on a cross. I think the symbolism with that, we need to talk about it. I ain't saying change it.
Hmm.
I just think, I'm from Mississippi. My church was bombed, well before I was alive. But my grandfather, our church, my grandfather was a trustee when Taylorsville UMC, which is my home church, was bombed back in the 60s. It was on one side of the road. And then, the Klan was bombing churches all across, in Brandon and Jackson. And now where it sits, They built it on the other side of the road. And so my granddad's name is still in the cornerstone. So I think some of those um, conversations around symbols, I mean, I think are legitimately important. So I would need to sit with what a substantive agenda would look like, but I would certainly get your input, my friend, on get your counsel.
I think you've laid out a starting point. I do think that it's important to I think engage memory and some honesty around that. And I do think that there would be a list of issues that perhaps could be talked about. One of the things that I appreciate about you as a leader, and this has always been a part of you, and I also think this would be a part of the conversation. It would be, um, I'm curious about uh, ways of approaching uh, a historic institutional structure that has all of the things that an old vine has. It's brittle, it's deeply rooted, all those things. But there is a need for forward thinking, entrepreneurial, kind of, I don't know, just kind of an innovative approach to what could be. And I do think, like, I've appreciated along the way that one of the things about you as a leader is certainly you can preach the word of God. And I think you can lead the people, but you also have this business background, kind of an entrepreneurial spirit about you that I really have always appreciated. And I see it infused in the way that you're leading at Cascade.
Thank you.
And I just wonder if you could maybe reflect on that dimension, because I think that would need to be a part of the conversation as well. Um,
Well, absolutely.
so how do maybe talk a little bit about your background? I know you're a business undergrad, but kind of where you kind of captured the spirit of kind of an entrepreneurial mindset and the way in which that impacts and informs how you think about your work at Cascade.
Sure, sure. Definitely from my dad. So my dad has been a entrepreneur, CEO for 33 years. So all of my life, and 35 years. And so growing up, with a business owner, small business owner, I've always worked for him, from delivery driver to, 13, 14, being in boardrooms with him, learning his business and being able to meet clients. And so I have only known that side of life in terms of business. And my dad, you know, businessman, coach, Sunday school teacher. I mean, he was always present with us, mom too. But yeah, that's where I got it from. And so when I went to business school, um, just kind of got the tools, but always had that drive to start something, like start things. I mean, that's always been and when I feel a way, man, when I'm not doing something, I almost feel kind of weird. Like, when I'm in a season and I haven't started something new or started something different. Um, and so that for me was important. Because you can have all the great ministry ideas in the world if you can't fund them, what is that going to do? Or if people can't trust you with their money, or if they can't trust you to manage, what is given, and it's a stewardship issue. For me, when I look at the life of Jesus, he had one of the best business models of leadership and discipleship that you could really study, and I think somebody really needs to study it, and people have. But look at the people that he had on his team. I mean, he went to get a tax collector, right? Went to get Matthew. He wants to reach other tax collectors, but he has to have somebody who knows money, who knows commerce, who knows economy. He has a CFO. Judas is the keeper of the money bag. So, you've got to have, and then he's got entrepreneurs, all the fishermen who were, was Peter and, Andrew and all the others who were fishermen who had fishing businesses. And so he was able to move kind of throughout not just the Greco-Roman world, healing and working miracles and all the things. And that was important, but it was also important for him to be able to talk about money, over and over again, and to do it in a way, I think, wherein he was informed. I wonder what those conversations with Matthew we're like, around the fire, somewhere on the mountain, just hanging out. When we don't read about these moments in the Gospels, I wonder, was he asking Matthew about, being a tax collector? What does that mean? Or Judas, who obviously had a financial background because he wouldn't have been able to keep the money back. So, I mean, business is so important in the life of the church. And now, kind of serving where I'm serving, and you see it all the time when you deal with staff. I mean, it's all kinds of. I mean, the bigger staff you have, the larger number of staff persons you have. I mean, you have all the issues that come with it, and good and bad, right? And so, people. I love the fact that preachers know how to preach, but do you know HR? And can you hire people, who know that? Can you galvanize a team around you so that you can be aligned to vision and to grow, but also understand what's going on within the bounds of the church? Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, people have to trust you with their resources. And I always say this, Chris, nobody wants to put their hard-earned money in lazy hands. They just don't. And I tell my team that all the time, that these folk trust us with millions of dollars every year that they freely give. And it's a stewardship issue for us. And so I can love you and I'm going to love you. But if you aren't stewarding this the right way, you're not going to be able to serve here, but I'm going to still love you. I mean, serve on our team, that is, be hired. And that's been a joy. It's been a joy. It's been a burden at times, but it has also helped me understand that knowing theory and theology and being able to preach is not enough to be an effective pastor today.
What do you? I appreciate you sharing that, and I agree. I agree, and I certainly have learned a ton from various folks who lead both in the church at significant scale, and who have um, uh, learned some of the wisdom that comes from leadership and education or healthcare, you know, politics or entrepreneurship. All those things are super helpful. But I do think they're essential at this particular stage of the church's life. I mean, I guess one of the things that we have a lot of resources and assets, both,
Yeah.
physical assets, monetary assets that are just kind of in various places. And it does seem like a moment where we need some fresh thinking about,
Hmm.
how to manage those resources in a way that might be collaborative. But I think the work that you're talking about would be priority setting, it seems to me, that has to be kind of it has to coincide with creating, you know, um, some strategies for this old vine to graft in some maybe some new branches so that we could produce some new
Yeah.
fruit, man. Like, I think
Yeah.
that there's
Yeah.
there's and the thing that I appreciate about you is that you're actively engaged, and I see it. I see it in your Bible studies that you do online, or I see it in some of your sermons that I find my way to on the internet, through social media. I see it in the way in which you're posturing your own leadership and your team, to kind of help us imagine what it would look like to engage not just Southwest Atlanta, but Midtown Atlanta and the greater Atlanta metro area. I assume will be part of kind of the future for you. And I just, I guess the thing that comes to mind to me to say is just like, take care of yourself, because
Yeah.
as I see where you're headed and what you're doing, and I just want to figure out ways to pour fire on that. But I also want to make sure, how do you, as you're engaging and kind of posturing yourself for growth, I do think it's important to think about, like, how do you sustain that through time, especially as a
Yeah.
father of young children,
Yeah.
as a husband. Kind of how are you thinking about managing growth, the team, all the responsibilities that you have, but also, kind of making sure that you're sustaining this thing over the long term?
Yeah, man. 40 is on the horizon. I don't know when this podcast is going to air, but
Oh, yeah, it'll be
I,
by the time I'll be more gray and more bald by the time it is. I've already passed the threshold, man.
man, I tell you. So, I turned 40 in 3 weeks, and so I am, I'm in a different season now, man. I'm just pacing different. Dr. Luther Smith, I use him as an example, who was also my professor at Candler. I tell the story that he gave me one of my papers back, and it looked like he just bled all over my paper, man. It was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. I was like, man, I thought Dr. Smith, I'm your favorite student. I thought I wrote a great paper. So he called me to his office. He said, Kevin, I want to talk to you about this. And so went to his office, and he sat me down, and he said, Kevin, this was a great paper, but it was the wrong one for this assignment. And in other words, I didn't read the instructions, and I just kind of missed, because I was busy. I was doing ministry. I was working at these churches and doing all this stuff. And he sat me down and he said, there's no doubt you were born to do ministry. There's no doubt that, you're going to excel in whatever you do in ministry. But you have to learn early that ministry is a long distance marathon. It's not a sprint. So he said to me, you have to change your pace. And he told me that as a first year seminarian. And I have always kept that with me, just that sage wisdom. So I think I've sustained because I think now I know when to change pace. And that's kind of where I am, man. I'm looking at a different pace, hiring more high functioning people and staff to be able to sustain that and to do it at a high level. And then, I'm not trying to do everything. We've got an amazing team, and so my kids keep me grounded, and my wife, and so it's really a joy. So yeah, man, just trying to change pace.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for being with us today on the Wait podcast. We've had a great conversation with Reverend Dr. Kevin Muriel. We experienced some technical difficulty at the end of the conversation, but it was an awesome experience talking with Kevin. We've known one another for a long time, and I really appreciate him taking the time to be with us. If you love the episode, I would encourage you to share it with a friend, somebody else that may be thinking about the future of the church. And like and subscribe the Wait podcast wherever it is that you listen, and we'll be back next week with another episode.